current narrative about China, about U.S.-China relations, U.S. policy towards China is wrong. Second point is that policy, which is known as engagement, has achieved pretty much all of the goals that it set out to achieve. And it's still the operative policy, though it has been somewhat derailed. The third point is that what is now being called decoupling or containment 2.0, or even a new Cold War, is both undesirable and unlikely. And the final point is that going back to the way relations with China were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, is impossible. But in going forward, some revised version of engagement is the only viable alternative. It's desirable for the United States, and it's absolutely necessary for China. I'll elaborate on each of those points, unfortunately briefly, but hopefully we'll make them clear. Let me begin with why the current narrative on China is wrong. I should preface the why it's wrong by summarizing what it is for you. The basic argument is that the U.S. policy of engagement, which normally is dated from 1978 in the Carter administration, and was carried out by 8 administrations, that policy was naive, that it was foolish, and it was harmful to the United States interests. This policy is now alleged to have been intended or expected to transform China into a democratic political system that basically would act in ways consistent with, congruent with U.S. policy desires. And that this policy foolishly created an ideological rival, an economic rival, and a military rival that is determined and, in the view of some, capable of displacing the United States atop the international system. The proposed corrective to this foolish and naive policy is comprehensive decoupling, and a whole of government approach with countermeasures that sound a lot like what I would call containment 2.0. The idea that we can preserve our place in the international system, that we can protect American jobs, preserve the American way of life by decoupling from China, or only by decoupling from China, is the narrative. This narrative is wrong for a lot of reasons. Partly it's wrong for reasons of bad memory or misunderstanding. And partly it's wrong because the narrative, as used by some, deliberately misconstrues the past. Now, it's easy and common to say Americans have no memory, because it's basically a true statement. The distant past for us is last Tuesday. We're looking forward most of the time. But there is a simple demographic reality that far more than half of the population of the United States was not born when this policy was formulated and began to be implemented. We don't make a point in our politics of continually re-explaining, revalidating decisions that by and large are not contentious and by and large are perceived to be working. So one reason for the persistence and continuity, remarkable continuity of this policy is that, with the exception of our quadrennial presidential elections, where we always have a China bogeyman to be blamed for things, After the election, the policy pretty quickly reverted to what it had been before the election, even with dramatic changes, as from Carter to Reagan, or Clinton to George W. Bush on there. Because it wasn't really contentious. It wasn't contentious because there were a lot of constituents who benefited from this policy. I'll come back to that. The actual origins of this are deeply enmeshed in the Cold War. The Nixon visit to China to find a counterbalance to Moscow. The Carter-Deng normalization in the form of diplomatic relations is inseparable from Cold War security concerns. That the principal objective of the United States was to complicate Moscow's calculus. By the time we get to Carter, the view is that the Cold War is going to go on indefinitely, if not forever. If China was going to be a partner in this indefinite struggle, it was better to have a strong partner than a weak partner. So with the policy changes that China made, it became possible for the US to engage in a way that would contribute to China's development, make it economically stronger. It created an opportunity for the United States to pursue the bundle of objectives that basically it had pursued vis-a-vis China from the earliest days of the United States. And the bumper sticker characterization of that are three S's: security, sales, and souls. Security, safety, stability in that region of the world and for American interest. Sales, the commercial appeal of the large China market. And souls, reflecting the missionary origins of this, but now it's in human rights. It's people to people. It's civil society, kind of. We wanted to be able to engage both commercially and in people to people, and this would contribute to our security, as well as having a political relationship that did so. It was also intended to lock in the policy changes that were announced by the post-Mao regime headed by Deng Xiaoping. The slogan was reform at home and opening to the outside world, adopting export-led growth as a strategy of development. So here the policy objective was to lock in those policies, because the history of China up to that point was one that gave you whiplash with the rapid and dramatic shifts in policy during the Maoist era. So this was to enmesh China in the rules-based international system, to build China's stake in continuity, stability, predictability by providing tangible, concrete benefits to the people of China and to the self-strengthening efforts of the People's Republic. It was also to develop a web of ties. The idea was that the relationship couldn't be stable, and we couldn't take full advantage of opportunities if we relied solely on a government-to-government channel and mechanism. This was to utilize the incredible character of the US federal system, the US system that leaves many, indeed the majority of decisions to the private sector, business sector, NGOs, academic institutions, associational groups, doctors, engineers, and the like. So it was to create possibilities to build connections, and the logic was simple. If you have one connection, government to government, that's a single point of failure. If you build bureaucracy to bureaucracy, school to school, military to military, and so on, when you have problems in one or two areas, you've got a lot more that will sustain the relationship. You create countervailing pressures within each system that lead to stability on both sides. There was an expectation that modernization would change China. expectation based in modernization theory, in democratic theory, indeed in Marxist theory, but also with very nascent examples in East Asia, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, and in South Korea, that a Confucianist system could transform into one that was more open. But there was never a timeline on it. There was never by year X, China is going to be a parliamentary democracy, a presidential democracy, a system, a society just like ours. That for decades, I was in, if not every, a great percentage of the policy discussions on it, and that simply never came up. But what did engagement achieve? I said one of the points is that it achieved most of its goal. The new narrative would hold that it was good for China, but not for the United States. That there's no question that China is much better off. It's a much better place than it was before engagement. We have not become a worse country because of our interaction with China. I find it very hard to develop a credible argument that says our partisan divide, our racial problems, indeed our economic problems are the fault of engagement with China. Just one example. China stole American jobs. No. US-based boards of directors responding to their largely US citizen shareholders decided to move some activities outside of the United States, and some of those went to China. That's where the decisions were made: New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, not in Beijing. But it's easier for businessmen and politicians to blame somebody else. What are the benefits to the United States? One, that very seldom, there have been no wars in Asia since the Vietnam War. The end of the Vietnam War coincides with the onset of the engagement process with China. The Cold War is over. One of the principal objectives was to complicate Moscow's calculus. Normalization starts when the Soviet Union was at the apex of its power and its assertive posture in international affairs. And now it's been relegated to the dustbin of history. That's not directly because of US-China relations, but that's certainly a factor in that. That regional prosperity. Asia is the most dynamic region of the world. Rapid growth, improvements in social conditions in many countries, not just China, made possible by stability. And the stability has to do with the predictability of the US-China relationship, which affects the US-Japan-China relationship. It's been incredibly important to the success in the region. It didn't just make China wealthier. It was designed to increase economic opportunities and American prosperity, and it did. Let me use some numbers that will underscore this. In 1978, when this policy began, the US accounted for slightly less than 20%, 26% of the global economy. 40 years later, China's decades of double-digit growth, lots of other developments like the breakup of the Warsaw Pact, the expansion of the European Union, the shift to export-led growth in more than half the countries in the world. The US share of the world economy has declined. We're all the way down to 24.5%. Over the same period, the US share of global population declined from 5.2 to 4.3%. On a per capita basis, we account for more of the global economy today than we did 40 years ago. China's GDP has grown. The world's GDP has grown tremendously. China has gone from a few $100 billion to $13 trillion. US went from $2.5 to $20 trillion. And even more importantly, on a per capita basis, we went from $10,000 to $63,000. We've got an enormous distribution problem in our country, but the policy that was designed to enhance American prosperity by making a wealthier Chinese partner that would buy more stuff from us and from the world clearly has worked. What about China's military capacity, and how does that endanger us? Again, the things that are pointed to, it has been expanding its military now for a couple of decades. It's got more Navy ships than we do. That works if you don't care about the quality and capabilities of it. China now has 4 or 5, depending on how you count it, militarized man-made islands in the South China Sea. These are unsinkable aircraft carriers. Okay, they're also immovable aircraft carriers that any military person, they probably would not last a minute in actual conflict. China has one ally, the same ally that it had in 1978, the indispensable great asset North Korea. The United States now has 49 military allies with collective security commitments, leaving aside the non-allied partners like Israel or India. But we have 9 more allies than we did in 1978. China has lofty ambitions, Belt and Road Initiative, Made in China 25, but an aspiration is not an achievement. So we ought to not be afraid of what has not yet happened and treat it as if we must respond to a reality that is still very much dependent on China's relationship with us. So why is decoupling unlikely and undesirable? Part of it has to do with the nature of the engagement policy, which was, as I noted before, not simply to forge a government-to-government relationship with a Communist Party state apparatus. It was to facilitate interaction among all of the components of the American system, 50 states, the business community, private sector more broadly, academic institutions, medical research facilities, NGOs of all kinds. There are literally thousands of American organizations that have some type of a relationship with counterparts in China. It was a deliberate part of the policy. One of the reasons that the relationship is as bad as it is right now is because, I blame Beijing, China has managed to alienate virtually every single one of those constituencies at the same time, that we've lost the shock absorbers and the counterbalancing, and it's mostly, in my view, China's fault. The most important of the constituencies of this array is the business community. We are a capitalist country. Promoting sales and commerce was one of the objectives of the policy. The pattern in the United States after every election, presidential election, up to 2016 was the day after the election, the business community would come metaphorically here to whoever had been elected and say this complaining about China policy and declaring you're going to change, that's fine for the election, but now get real. It's about real money. This is about production supply chains that took a long time to develop. Don't mess it up. So you've got a business community pressing for stability. Business community has got a more powerful voice in politics than most others. But you've got all of these other constituencies that also want to preserve business as usual and weigh in, and that led to stability. And it was a non-contentious policy by and large. So in my years, and I had 15 years in very senior positions in Washington as a global guy, China almost never was on the agenda because the policy wasn't contentious. It was worked in the bureaucracy. Lower levels just kept it going, and bureaucracies do what they do best, which is maintenance of already established practices. As we look forward, virtually none of these constituencies, including our military, want to make China an enemy. A rival, yeah, sure, we have rivals, rivalry and competition, all that's not a bad thing. But to make it the enemy, nobody wants to do that. That's a break in our system on how far policy can deviate from what it has been working. And as long as it's perceived to be mostly working, it'll continue. Why is it desirable for the US? It's not just inertia. It's comfortable. It's a familiar shirt, comfortable pair of shoes that it's too much hassle to shift to something else. We need to stay engaged with China because it's a major player by virtue of its size and its capabilities. Access to the wallets and the brains of 1.4 billion people is pretty important, whether it's commercial sales, whether it is scientific research, or it is cooperation to address the global challenges that confront everybody: climate change, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, water availability, food safety, infectious diseases, COVID-19. If you wanted a concrete example where the breakdown in US-China relations has been an impediment to dealing with this problem. No international challenges can be met without the United States and China being on basically the same page. If we're going to work together, we have to have a relationship that's at least minimally cooperative. The rest of the world won't do anything on these issues unless it perceives that the Americans and the Chinese are in basic agreement. As long as one or the other can veto, pull the rug out from under, thwart it, why would anybody invest money or capital to deal with the problem? Another reason continued engagement is desirable from a US perspective, should we decide to decouple? Should we actually go the route that the current narrative advocates? We'd be all alone. Our allies are not going to go with us. They would think that would be a stupid and counterproductive course of action. So we're going to be out there all alone, telling our allies not to do things they think is in their interest, not to do things that they undertook in part because of the conditions we created with the policy of engagement. It would further undercut US leadership and influence in the world. Why does China need it? It's desirable for us, it's necessary for China. Economic growth development is still the number one priority of the government, of the regime, of the people. And yes, China has become more prosperous than it was. China's per capita GDP, per capita income is still below the world average. Despite the decades of very rapid growth, China is not at a level of the world average. It's still a middle-income country. It still faces the challenges of escaping what economists call the middle-income trap, making the transition from imitator to innovator. Without sustained growth, they can't maintain social stability. They can't meet the rising expectations and needs and demands of the population. I mentioned at the beginning that more than half of the United States population has no memory of the bad old days of the Cold War before we began engagement with China. In China, it's about 75% of the population has no memory of anything other than rapid and sustained growth. This is a performance-based system. The miracle growth ended almost a decade ago. It's less than half that now. The coronavirus has taken it in a negative direction for the first time in 40 years. So at a time when demands and expectations from the populace are increasing dramatically, the capacity of the government to meet those demands is shrinking, it's decreasing. One of the quiet discussions, and again, I was in many of these over the 70s and 80s, 90s, China envisioned engaging with the rules-based liberal order as a temporary expedient to jumpstart its economy. We're going to jumpstart its economy, rebuild its national strength, increase its international influence, and then pull back, disengage, decouple, if you will. It was an instrumental means, and they thought they could do that. And we said, in essence, you're welcome to try. Good luck, but you can't do it. Because once you're in, you're on an escalator. And either you continue to go up in prosperity and influence and stability, or you get off. If you get off, you stop growing. If you stop growing, you've got a domestic problem. You've got a legitimacy problem. So we had conflicting objectives and expectations. History hasn't ended. The Chinese have not proven that they've developed a different system. When they shifted away from the developmental model that was a key to engagement policy, growth stopped. Didn't stop. Growth slowed to less than 50% of what it was. They've alienated not just the constituencies of the United States, but virtually every neighbor, virtually every other country around the world. They've got a problem. They need growth. For growth, they need the good relationship, basically good relationship with the United States and the US-led world. The free world is a kind of an anachronistic concept, but the most developed countries of the world is very much a relevant concept. That's the free world. That's the same set of players, the same set of US allies that are linked together in ways that under a different administration in the United States could act as a unit as opposed to independently. So what should the US do? We can't do nothing. We must respond to things have changed. We don't want to go back, can't go back. There's no support for the Cold War policies that were applied to China as they were applied in Europe, applied elsewhere in East Asia, where we would provide for the security of all, we'd provide public goods, we'd have our markets more open than others to us. We're not going back there, but we're not going to close ourselves off. So we have to do what we need to do most is avoid doing things that make it harder for Beijing to make the, quote, right decisions, to get back on the reform track, to continue to pursue prosperity and influence by working with and within the rules-based order, as opposed to outside it. The consequences of the engagement policy for the United States, in my judgment, have been overwhelmingly positive. The negative ones are not just engagement with China, it's the negative side of globalization. It's failure to do the things domestically to train our people, improve our education system, and so forth. We've got a pogo problem. Met the enemy and it's us. We have not done things that we should. But engagement is still playing out. As I said, history didn't end. It's not the US is destined for the dustbin of history and China is in the ascendant. We are a long way from being in decline. Look forward to Xiaoyu's comments.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tom. That was incredibly insightful. Xiaoyu.
Thank you. It's my great pleasure and honor to provide some comments and also reflections on U.S.-China relations. For me, U.S.-China relationship is not just a professional topic. It's also for me it's also personal. So if the topic is about the U.S. engagement with China, I'm not one of the products of the engagement because I was born and grew up in China. I received my bachelor's and master's degrees from Lankai University in China. Then I moved to Ohio and got my PhD there. Then I moved to Princeton. I was a postdoc fellow in the China and the World program there. After that, I moved to Reno, Nevada. So I have taught political science for many years here and UNR. So when we talk about U.S.-China relations, this is a very important topic for me, both professionally and personally. But I agree with Tom is that overall the engagement has been very successful, but there are also many challenges, problems. There are many worries. So I would like to make a few sort of reflections or comments on this relationship. The first, my comment is that the relationship is increasingly competitive. There are a lot of problems, challenges, but it's not a zero-sum game. So in many situations, it's not a zero-sum game. But I find sometimes, many times, people confuse these two concepts. Whenever they think about the relationship, there are competitive elements, then there's a zero-sum game. Whatever is good for China, that must be bad for the United States. That's not the case. We need to discuss a lot of issues more carefully, including trade, finance, climate change, technology, science, and research. We need to be more careful. There are competitive elements, increasingly competitive elements, but we should not seek any competition as a zero-sum game. So this is my first point. The second point I want to highlight is that the relationship, unlike the United States relationship with the Soviet Union, U.S.-China relationship is very complex, very sort of like a multi-dimensional. So it's not just a leader to leader or central government to federal government relationship. It's multi-dimensional. It's about Washington versus Beijing. It's also about different local communities, different sectors, business, higher education, scientific communities, their engagement with China. So sometimes we need to go beyond the relationship between the two capitals. So earlier this year, before the COVID-19, I joined a scholarly delegation organized by the National Committee of U.S.-China Relations. So we visit Beijing, then Guangdong and Hong Kong. And our impression is that before that trip, we talked with some officials in Washington, D.C., officials in the Trump administration. Our impression is that if we only talk with officials from Washington or either from Beijing, we will be totally depressing because a lot of negative narrative from both sides. But as long as our delegation moved to Guangdong, a local sort of provincial level, we see a lot of very dynamic economies. At local levels, they're very eager to collaborate with the United States. And also after that trip, we visit Washington State in Seattle, also before the COVID-19. And the local community still very eager to engage China, Washington State from state level and from their city level business sectors. They have benefited a lot from engagement with China. So the second point I want to emphasize is that the relationship is not just two capitals relationship. We need to think about this very multi-dimensional relationship, and also of course, people-to-people relationship. It's not about just two countries' relationship. And the third point I want to make is that decoupling, although a lot of people talking about decoupling, I think that's I completely agree with Tom, is that decoupling is a too simplistic approach. There are a lot of challenges in US-China relationship. So, but whenever people talk about decoupling, there's a question, what are the costs, right? What are the costs? So, and think about, as I mentioned, all these local communities, different business sectors, and even higher education. The American universities here, we have benefited a lot of these academic exchanges, even in recruitment of students and scholars in China. So if we think about decoupling, that will cause huge sort of damage to American interest and even American images internationally. So also, of course, I understand people have reasonable, legitimate concern about national security issues, American national security, national interest. But when we talk about national security, Tom has a high level government official, government position in Washington. He understand when we talk about national security, it's all about managing risk. It's not about eliminating all the risk, right? It's about all the trade-off. So when somebody talking about, okay, maybe out of 100,000 Chinese students, there are 1 or 2, 3 spies, then you cut all Chinese students' visa. That's ridiculous. That's not about managing national security threat. That's will cause huge disruptions for American systems, right? We need to think about more carefully. Whenever we talk about managing national security threat, it's about all kinds of trade-off, different risks, uncertainty, how you judge. It's not about entirely eliminate the threat. So that's another point. My final point is that I think although people complain about China in the United States, in China, some commentators, politicians complain about America in China. But ultimately, for these two countries, the priority is always domestic. So the long-term trajectory of American position in the world will largely depend on economic growth, domestic reform, how we handle our domestic priority. So America's number one problem is not China. China's number one problem is not America. So we need to think about how to sort of manage the relationship carefully, then how we can deal with our difficult domestic problems in a careful way. So let me end my comment there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xiaoyu. That was really helpful, and I can see that you two do agree on several points.
Uh-huh.
Let me go to the heart of some key questions here. So luckily, our NSF participants do have memory, Tom. And some of them even remember what you said the last time you spoke. So, which was just a couple years ago. So you were reminded in one of the questions that when you spoke to NSF a couple years ago, you referred to Xi as the fall guy in waiting. And so the question is, is that still true? And could you sort of touch on his solidification or increasing political power, combined with his seeming to express authoritarian positions over human rights, Hong Kong, those kinds of things? I'm going to separate the Hong Kong issue separately, but just talk specifically about where Xi is, where you think he is now, and how has that changed in the last 2 years?
I appreciate the memory. My term was scapegoat in waiting rather than fall guy in waiting, and I still think that's the case. That this is a tough system, that you don't make it to the top of it by being a pansy. But the kinds of controls and checks that were built into the system after Mao's death make collective leadership much more a reality in it. So Xi Jinping is in the position he is, in my judgment, because that's where the others in the top rank of the party leadership want him to be. That they put him in place because they wanted a leader that would make decisions, that would be decisive, that would break the constipation and paralysis that they judged to be inflicting their system. In order to increase his credibility, his charismatic authority, the system has built him up, chairman of everything, the core of the party, the core of the country, the wise leader that does everything. I may have mentioned 2 years ago, I can't remember exact timing, going to the special exhibition on the history of reform and opening, the 40th anniversary of it. 40 years, and probably 60% of that exhibition was devoted to the 5 years of Xi Jinping. It was as everything that came before was not as important. The flip side of visibility, high profile, somebody can make it, is if there is a problem, who's to blame? It's not the party, it's not the party Politburo, it's Xi Jinping. That's why he remains set up. And what's he accomplished in his time as the head of the country? He's presided over the end of miracle growth. He's he can be alleged to have taken China from the era of 10% growth to the era of less than 6%, and now negative 6.8% last quarter. He's alienated virtually the entire world. China's behavior under his leadership. BRI, his Belt and Road Initiative, been perceived as sort of China as Santa Claus bestowing benefits in a way of infrastructure and grants to China as a Shylock country that wants to have its loans repaid by countries that can't repay them because of declining commodity prices, because of COVID-19 and other, that the security of the environment, of the international environment for China has to be perceived as become worse. As China has become more assertive, particularly in East Asia and the South China Sea, countries that had, over the previous decade, distanced themselves from the United States. We wanted kind of a not alignment, not being dragged into things, to flocking back to being with the United States. They worry about us because they question our stability. So the short answer, the short conclusion to this is, I think there's a better than even chance that he'll leave at the end of his second term. If something goes really badly, and that means internal instability, he's the one who will pay the price on it. The link to Hong Kong, Hong Kong is a problem for him because of the danger that political demands, the masses in the streets, could spill over into the mainland on any one of a dozen issues, mishandling of COVID-19, that you've got, give or take, 250 million Chinese who worked in urban areas, returned to their place of origin, the countryside, largely for the holidays. Many are still out there. They've now been 3 months without pay. There's no social safety net. At some point, they're going to use up their savings, and they're going to demand something from the government that is going to have trouble meeting. So there is a tinder box out there, and maintaining stability is his number one priority, but it's also his number one requirement to stay in job.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. I'm going to move to a question that I'm going to send to both of you, which I think is an important point. A lot of the discussion that we've had so far has really focused on the financial, the economic issues of engagement. So the question is really fundamentally, if engagement is working so well or is so necessary, why does it appear to have been unable to move the needle in China on the human rights issue? So are we in the pejorative, are we trading human rights for cheap goods at Walmart? And if we are unable to move the needle, why continue the policy of engagement as it is now? So Tom, and then Xiaoyu.
Okay, 3 quick points. One is the human rights situation in China is a lot better today than it was 40 years ago. When I started going in the 70s, pretty much everybody was denied all kinds of basic rights, freedom, civil society. The situation where everybody's rights were outrageously oppressed. Now, there's much less denial of human decency, human rights to most Chinese most of the time. The glaring exception here is the Uyghurs, and there's no justification whatsoever for the treatment of Uyghurs. And whatever influence the United States might have had on that issue, if Mr. Bolton is right, was given away by the president on there. That it's paranoia, it's fear of secession, it's fear, it's mistreatment of minorities in there. Human rights, in my experience, globally, is best pursued through engagement, not through isolation. We have an example of decoupled policies, Cuba and North Korea. Maybe those policies just need a little more time. Maybe 50 plus years just isn't long enough to bring about the desired changes by refusing to engage. That when you're not engaged, you can't influence the situation. You can't change anybody's mind. That ranking human rights is more important than stopping proliferation. Ranking human rights is more important than dealing with global issues, of lifting people out of poverty. In my judgment, is a false choice. It's similar to a point that Xiaoyu is making about there are a lot of interconnected things. Ranking one ahead of another is quite natural because people have different interests, different experiences. Policy has to take into account how do you increase the chances to the maximum extent of achieving all of the things that you want and avoiding actions that, while they're completely focused in one area, have really deleterious effects in another. That we haven't done so well in changing human rights in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia as example number one, or treatment of Palestinians in Israel. That there are human rights problems in lots of countries, not just in China. Generally, we've done better when we've been engaged. When we unleash the corrosive power of Americans by acting as we are, by living our values to the extent that we do, that is a very, very powerful threat to repressive regimes. If we stay in the locker room, we don't get to play in human rights or any other arena.
Thanks, Tom. Jayu.
Okay, excellent questions. So I completely agree with Tom, and also I want to add a few points. First, so current China, today's China, there are a lot of human rights problems in China. Nobody should ignore those problems. But still, from a longer historical perspective, U.S. engagement has still been successful. Think about what's the alternative without Nixon's opening to China. I mean, China in the Mao era was like today's North Korea, just many times larger, right? So think about alternative. So that's my first point. Even though there are a lot of problems, human rights issues. The second point is that human rights, it's not just a unilateral one-way process. It's not just like the Americans should have moral high ground to criticize China. Human rights is a universal issue. So if we think about one point of the progress from China's perspective, that many years ago, human rights was a taboo concept in China. Nowadays, Chinese officials, at least, they are willing to engage with some of the dialogue. So that's a progress. That means human rights is not just the Chinese government only say, oh, human rights is Western concept, is American concept. No, it's human rights a universal concept. So this is my second point. So in the sense that the human rights dialogue between US and China from a unilateral one-way process, now it's a two-way process. Recognizing human rights is a two-way process. The third point I want to make is that the best way to promote democracy and human rights is not just to criticize the other country. From America's perspective, the best way to promote democracy is to make democracy work at home. So there are a lot of homework in the United States. So if we cannot make democracy work at home, the United States is losing moral high ground to improve human rights, democracy everywhere else. So that's my third point. So thank you.
Thank you, Jay.
Two quick additions to that. Excellent points, Chayu made. One is we have lost the moral high ground. That what has been happening in the U.S. for the last 3 weeks, as somebody who was, an activist, anti-war, racial equality demonstrator in the 60s and 70s, I'm greatly heartened by this. That not that we're having demonstrations, but that the prospect of real change in this country, I think, is greater than it has been in decades. If we actually improve social justice, make real progress on the racial divide, and try to fix our democracy, we will gain immeasurably in international stature. That the Chinese love to point to the demonstrations, particularly the first nights of looting and destruction. They're not going to like it so much if the outcome is we're a better place. That the people's voice, we the people, actually change events. The other point is a very simple one. that on a perspective, Americans in dealing with China, or Europeans too, Europeans are more adamant on this, to tell the Chinese how far they have to go on human rights. And the Chinese response, in effect, is, look how far we've come. That this is not a light switch where you throw it and it goes from bad to good. And if we need an example, look at our own country.
Excellent points, both of you. Thank you very much. I'm going to shift a little bit about putting engagement in the context of China's relationship with its surrounding partners or not partners. So before we get to the thorny one of whether Hong Kong, I hope you can both take and give us a little bit of insight on the issues of, first of all, the issue with China and India right now in Xinjiang, and also how that fits. If you look at India, how does it fit with the other neighboring countries, particularly, Bhutan, Nepal, the Himalayan countries? What's going on? And does our engagement, can that help clarify that situation? Can it help diffuse the tensions that we're seeing on these border issues? And what's their long game in sort of pushing things like closing passes and borders and having skirmishes on their borders? What's going on, and where do we fit into the equation?
One of the puzzles that I've grappled with for decades is why China and India don't settle their border. That it should be easy. It should be easy. That the Indian claimed land that China occupies and the China claimed land that India occupies are reasonably close in terms of area. In the area where the recent clashes are, there's no people. This is 15, 16, 17,000 feet. Some of this stuff is on a glacier. Nobody lives there. You can't grow anything there. You say, why would you fight over this? But despite probably 24 rounds of negotiations over the decades, they've never gotten closer to a solution. That if there were more time, I'd go into the Indian alignment with the Soviet Union as part of the containment that China saw. Now India drawing closer to the United States as a concern for China's security. But what is going on here is neither one of these proud countries can back off or feels able to compromise. That territorial integrity is such an important part of the legitimating mythology of the Communist Party. So whether it is submerged rocks in the South China Sea or glaciers in the Himalayas, that there's no ability to back off, no ability to compromise for the regime. Because if you can compromise on one of these, why can't Taiwan be independent? Why can't Xinjiang be independent? So they're in a political box. The final remark I would make, again, having watched pretty much annually these things during years when I was director of the China division and then director for East Asia, it's a function of snow melt that both sides pull back in the winter. Snow comes in, makes it impassable. Depending on where the troops are at the time, whether it melts on the Chinese side first or the Indian side, or where they want to pick, whoever it is moves forward. Who's got the first bare ground moves forward. The other one, and this has been scripted, highly kabuki most of the time. This is unusual because people die, and that makes it higher profile. But the real point here is stuff that goes on every year. They have a clash. They can't settle this. Clearly, they don't settle it because they don't want to settle it for some reasons. But in the context of China is the bad guy, China is the bully, this is getting a lot more attention in the United States than these things normally do, because it's one more bill of particulars of Chinese misbehavior. I have no idea over them whether it's China or India that has provoked more of these things. They're equally responsible.
Thank you. Xiaoyu.
Just very briefly, so regarding China-India relationship, it's a very, also a rather complicated relationship. Regarding recent like casualties, border disputes, I think this very tragic, unfortunate incident for both countries, actually. 23 Indian soldiers died. There are casualties on the Chinese side as well. For various reasons, the Chinese government is unwilling to sort of reveal the number, but there are definitely some Chinese casualties as well. So it's very unfortunate situation for both countries. But on the other hand, we also need to think about the other side of the story. This is a two most populous countries, both with nuclear weapons, both has strong and large military, but their sort of conflict level is not higher than sort of gangsters violence in Los Angeles or somewhere else. So that's also demonstrate self-restraints from both sides. By the way, the soldiers, they did not using arms. So it's like a street fight, very brutal, definitely, unfortunate. But on the other hand, there has been negotiations going on for many decades. Both sides realize ultimately the dispute cannot be settled militarily. So from the leadership perspective. So China, India, their disputes cannot really settle militarily, but because both are nuclear power, both have strong military, so they have demonstrated some restraint so far. So I think on the one hand, we read the news talking about all the big news, sensational, but on the other hand, we also need to recognize that all the positive outcome of ongoing diplomatic military dialogues between these two countries. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, so we just have a couple more minutes. I let the Q&A go a little longer because we were a little later getting started. So I'm going to throw out the question, which I'm hoping you could each touch on. I know it's a really thorny one to answer in 1 minute, but let me just summarize it. With or Hong Kong?
I don't know is the short one, because but Beijing is clearly going to pass legislation that the standing committee of the NPC that's formulating this will then presumably go to the Legislative Council in Hong Kong, and it'll have some content and it'll increase Beijing's legal right to intervene. How that gets implemented will make all the difference in the world. But like lots of countries, Chinese have all kinds of stuff on the books, but choose to environmental. China's got some of the best environmental protection legislation in the world. They just choose not to implement it or not to enforce it. So how they do it, how the population of Hong Kong responds to this, that the very broad generational protests that were pro-democracy, arguably, or anti-extradition law, whether they will want to make an issue of this before it is actually enforced, I don't know. It doesn't take very many people to start a protest movement. I think Beijing would like Hong Kong authorities to handle it, Hong Kong police, They would like to handle it. I think the last thing they want to do is use troops. I think this is, in their mind, this legislation makes it less likely that they'd have to send in military forces or even paramilitary police to do something in this. They hope that intimidation, they hope that the increased capacity will be an adequate deterrent. I wouldn't bet the ranch that it's going to work.
Yeah, regarding Hong Kong, I would like to sort of get back to the one sort of big concept called the one country, two systems. I think this is the formula Beijing proposed to sort of manage Beijing's relationship with Hong Kong. But this is a tricky formula in the first place because economically it's easy to sort of integrate mainland China's economy with Hong Kong's economy, a lot of collaborations. But politically, it's a tricky formula. Think about it. One country always, I mean, the recent legislative bill in China, this is just accumulated all these years' problems, sort of differences between Beijing and Hong Kong. Beijing always emphasized one country is the precondition of two systems. And a lot of Hong Kong people, politicians, local communities, they advocate the two system is very important. So Hong Kong should maintain definitely not only the liberty and rule of law they have already enjoyed so far, they should have a more direct democracy. So then there's the boundary case in the sense that how to handle this. If we think about another sort of summary of this formula, how could an increasingly democratic city, a liberal city, coexist within an illiberal and authoritarian system? So that's, I think it's a tricky formula. I would say in the first place. The second point I want to make is that the United States has important interest regarding Hong Kong issue, definitely. But there are limitations to what extent, even given the Congress passed the bill, Hong Kong bill, what kind of legislative actions, there are limitations how the United States can really shape some of the domestic political process in Beijing. So definitely Beijing leaders, they will consider international pressure, but when they move this legislative process, their top priority is still domestic politics. So they will consider international pressure, but they will not prioritize international pressure. That's a difficult pose challenges for the United States. The second point is that America's sort of policies, how could the United States sanction China without hurting people in Hong Kong? That's a very tricky situation. So that's a very tricky situation. If the United States say, oh, Beijing does not respect one country, two system, the United States should remove sort of special status of Hong Kong within the American legal or trade system, that hurt hundreds of thousands of Hong Kong people. So, right? So how could balance? That's a very difficult situation. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And thank you for staying on to answer a few extra questions. We had lots of questions that unfortunately we didn't get to, touching on the situation between China and North Korea, China and Australia, China's motivation on growth versus a relationship with the United States. So I can see this will be an extended discussion. I do hope that both of you will return to join us for these discussions in the future. We are looking at some formats to be able to have longer discussions in the future. So thank you very much, both Tom and Chayu, for your excellent insight, for sharing your knowledge. And I do want to make a plug. Tom, can you hold up your book?
I will. I'll hold up my book.
So hold it. Well,
here?
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Don't move. Okay, so I did put a link in there in our announcement to Fateful Decisions. So we will have an opportunity, or you will have an opportunity to look at some of the more in-depth writings from both of them, and Jiayu, you as well. So thank you for joining us, all of the NSFers. Please, thank you for staying on. And if there are follow-up questions, I have captured them in the chat box, and I will pass them on, since I know who they came from, to Tom and Jayu, and perhaps you'd be willing to take some of your discussion on email, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing NSF again in a month when we come to talk to you about something totally different. And I'm sure we will return to China and China issues with the United States in the near future. So everybody have a safe and wonderful day, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.